Your father is trash." That is what my husband's father said to me in front of 180 guests on the night everything changed. He did not shout it. He said it the way you might mention the weather, holding a glass of something imported, with the whole room close enough to listen. And the strange part, the part I keep returning to, is that my father was standing close enough to hear every word. He heard it, and he smiled. My name is Marguerite Ansel. I am 41 years old. I live in Sonoma, California, and for the last 16 years I have made my living reading wine the way some people read faces. I am a certified sommelier. I can taste a glass poured in silence and tell you the region, most years the vintage, and often the soil the vines were rooted in. It is not a magic trick, it is attention. It is the same attention my father taught me before I could reach the counter. My father's name is Etienne Ansel. He is a vintner. He owns 12 acres on a single dirt road east of town, and on those 12 acres he has grown wine grapes for 41 vintages, one for every year of my life. He has dirt under his nails that will not come out no matter how he scrubs. He has hands like tree bark, and he is the most patient man I have ever known, because you cannot grow good wine in a hurry, and he stopped being in a hurry a long time ago. If this is your first time here, take a moment to hit like and subscribe, and drop your city and the time where you are in the comments. I read every single one. It matters more than you know, especially for a story like this one. My father raised me mostly alone. My mother left when I was 6, and after that it was the two of us and the vines. Other children had bedtime stories. I had my father walking me through the rows at dusk, pressing a leaf between his fingers, telling me the ground was thirsty or the ground was content. He never raised his voice at me, not once. When I did something foolish, and I did plenty, he would go quiet, and the quiet was worse than any shouting because it meant he was disappointed. And I would have crawled through gravel to fix it. So you should understand what it did to me to hear my husband's father call him trash across a crowded room and watch him let it pass like it was nothing. Let me go back. The man I married is named Grant Holloway. He is decent. I want to say that plainly, because what happened is not really about him. Grant grew up in a family with money, the kind that has been sitting in these accounts for 3 generations. His people made their fortune in commercial real estate, and they have never once let anyone forget it. His mother is Vivian, his father as Charles. And from the first dinner I attended at their house, I understood that I was being measured. The first slight was small. So small I almost talked myself out of noticing it. It was the seating at that first dinner. There were 12 of us at a long table, and the Halloways had placed cards hand-lettered, because of course they did. My father and I arrived together, and when we found our cards, we had been placed at the far end, past the cousins, past a business associate none of us had met, down where table narrows and the candlelight does not quite reach. Grant was seated up near his mother. I told myself it meant nothing. Every table has an end. But my father noticed. He always notices. He pulled out my chair, sat down beside me, unfolded his napkin, and said very softly, "Good seats. You can see everyone from here." And he meant it kindly. That was the thing about him. He turned the insult into a view. The second slight came over the wine. Vivian had ordered dinner catered by some firm in the city, and when the wine was poured, I recognized it immediately. It was a Napa Cabernet, a good one, retail around $80 a bottle, nothing shameful. But it had been opened far too early and served far too warm, and the fruit had gone flat and stewed. I did not make a scene. I would never. But when the server came around, I quietly asked whether there might be a second bottle we could let breathe a few minutes longer, and I mentioned the temperature. Vivian heard me. She set down her fork. "Marguerite," she said, smiling in a way that did not reach her eyes, "we don't need a lecture on wine at the dinner table. Some of us just enjoy it." There was a small laugh around the table. My father looked at his glass, turned it once by the stem, and said nothing. And I felt my face go warm, because reading wine is my profession, the thing I have spent my life becoming good at, and she had made it sound like a party trick I was pushing on people. I want to be honest about how I felt in that moment, because this is where the indignation started, and it never fully left. I was not embarrassed for myself. I have been corrected by better people than Vivian Holloway. I was embarrassed for my father, sitting there in his one good jacket, watching his daughter get talked down to at a table full of strangers who thought they were better than us. The third slight was about where we came from. Later that same night, over dessert, Charles asked my father what he did. My father told him, 12 acres, wine grapes, east of Sonoma. And Charles nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he has already decided the answer does not interest him, and he said, "Ah, so farming." "You could call it that," my father said. "Out in the sticks," Vivian added, and she said the word the way you would hold something at arm's length. "I don't know how you stand the quiet. Charles and I need the city. We'd go out of our minds out there in all that dirt." "The dirt is rather the point," my father said, gently, not sharp, just true. They did not hear him. They had already moved on to talking about a restaurant opening downtown. And I sat there watching my father, a man who has coaxed life out of that dirt for 4 decades, be dismissed as a hobbyist by 2 people who had never grown anything but a bank balance. Here is what you have to understand about my father's silence. It was not weakness. I have seen him stand between a spooked truck driver and a fire in the drying shed without flinching. His silence was a choice. He had decided, somewhere along the way, that he did not need these people to know who he was. But I had not made that peace. I was still young enough, still raw enough, to want them to see him. The 4th slight was the one that cut me deepest, and it happened at the engagement dinner, closer to the wedding. We were all standing in the Halloway's kitchen, that enormous kitchen where nobody actually cooks, and Grant's cousin, a smug man named Preston, was pouring drinks. My father had come straight from the vineyard. He had showered, changed, done everything right, but his hands were his hands, and there is only so much you can do about 41 years of pruning knives and trellis wire. Preston looked down at my father's hands as he took his glass and said, loud enough for the room, "Jesus, what happened to your hands? Old man, you wrestle a tractor?" And the room laughed. Grant laughed too. Before he caught himself, I saw him catch himself. But by then it was already in the air. My father looked at his own hands for a moment, turning them over. Then he said, 41 harvests, every one of them left a mark. And he took a slow sip of his wine, and he smiled at Preston like he had just been paid a compliment. That smile. I have thought about that smile so many times since, because it was the same smile he would wear at my wedding when Charles called him trash in front of every guest. It was not the smile of a man who did not understand he was being insulted. It was the smile of a man who knew something the rest of the room did not. I did not understand it yet. I only knew that watching my father be laughed at by a boy who had never worked a day in the sun made something in me go cold and quiet and steady. Not angry, not yet, just very still, the kind of still where you start paying attention. The 5th slight was the one I nearly missed because it was aimed at me instead of him. When the wedding invitations went out, my father was not given a +1. I checked the list myself because I could not believe it. Every Halloway cousin had a +1. The business associates had +1s. But my father, the father of the bride, the man who was paying for a good portion of the flowers out of a savings account it had taken him decades to fill, had been listed alone, just his name, as if he were an afterthought, as if he might not even come. I asked Vivian about it, carefully, the way you ask about something you already know the answer to, and she waved her hand and said, "Oh, I assumed he'd just come with you, dear. It seemed simpler. It's not as though he'd bring a date." And there was that laugh again, soft, dismissive, certain. It's not as though he'd bring a date, as if my father were furniture, as if he could not possibly have a life, a companion, a world of his own outside those 12 acres. And the truth, the thing that made my throat tighten was that he did have a world, a whole one. A world these people would have crawled to be part of if they had known the first thing about it. But they did not know, and he did not tell them. That was the loop I could not stop turning over in my mind in the weeks before the wedding. Why my father, who could have silenced every one of them with a single sentence about his work, chose instead to smile and sip and let them believe he was small. I asked him about it once. We were out in the rows at dusk, the way we had been 1,000 times, and I finally said what I had been carrying. "Why do you let them talk to you like that?" He did not answer right away. He crouched down, took a pinch of soil, rubbed it between his fingers, and let it fall. "You taste a wine," he said, "when it's ready, not before. If you open it too soon, all you get is the tannin, the harshness, you miss what it becomes." He stood up slowly, brushing off his hands. "People are the same, Margot. Some of them show their true character early. Others make you wait. and some of them, the loud ones, they show it the moment they think no one important is watching. They think I'm not important, I said. They think neither of us is. He looked out over the vines, over the one dirt road that led out to the highway. Let them keep thinking it. A wine doesn't argue with the person who calls it cheap. It just waits to be poured. I did not fully understand him. I thought he was telling me to swallow it, to be patient, to let it go. And I loved him too much to press, so I let it drop. But I noticed something that evening that I did not think about again until much later. There was the case of wine sitting in his cool room that I did not recognize, not his own labels, something else. A prestige bottling, imported, the kind of thing you see behind glass at the good shops with a 3-figure price tag. $400 a bottle, if I had to guess, and I would guess close. I asked him why he had it. He said a friend had sent it. He said it the way he says things when he does not want to say more, and I let that drop too. I should not have, because that same wine, that exact label, was about to walk into my wedding reception in the hands of Charles Halloway, who would raise it over 180 guests and use it to teach my father a lesson about class. He would read the name off the front of the bottle. He would talk about terroir and prestige and pedigree, all the words rich men use when they want to sound like they understand something they only bought. And he would look down the length of that room at my father, the farmer, the man with the ruined hands, and he would say the cruelest thing anyone has ever said to me in my life. What Charles did not know, what none of them knew, was that my father had already read the back of that bottle. He knew exactly what it was, and he was still smiling out there among his vines, waiting for the room to finish laughing. The wedding was in October on the Halloway property, because of course it was on the Halloway property. Vivian had made that clear months in advance.
A vineyard, she said.
Once was charming, but it did not have valet parking, and where would people put their cars? So we married in a white tent on a lawn that had never grown anything but grass, in front of 180 guests, most of whom I had met exactly once. The ceremony itself was fine. Grant was steady. I meant every word I said. And when I looked out into the rows of chairs and found my father in the front, in his one good jacket, sitting very straight with his ruined hands folded in his lap, I nearly lost my composure because he was smiling at me the way he smiles at a vine that has finally taken after a hard winter. Proud, patient, certain that the waiting had been worth it. Then came the reception, and the reception is where it happened. The Halloways had taken over the wine. I should have expected it. They had hired a firm to handle the bar, and they had made a point of telling everyone, more than once, that they had brought in something special for the toasts, a prestige label, imported. The kind of thing Charles said to a cluster of his golf friends, that separates people who know from people who guess. I knew the label the moment I saw the first bottle on the service table. I knew it because I had seen it 3 weeks earlier sitting in a case in my father's cool room, and he had told me a friend had sent it. Same estate, same tier, roughly $400 a bottle, and I would have bet my certification on it being close. I remember standing there in my wedding dress, holding a glass of ice water, feeling something cold and slow move through me. Because I had tasted my father's fruit my whole life, and I was beginning to wonder. I did not say anything, not yet. But I found the head server, a young woman named Dana, who had been kind to me all evening, and I asked her a small favor. I asked her to set aside one of those bottles, unopened, and keep it near the head table where I could reach it. She looked at me a little oddly, the way you look at a bride making a strange request on her wedding day. But she nodded, and she did it. I did not fully know why I was asking. I only knew my father had that same wine in his cool room. And he had smiled when he told me a friend sent it, and my father does not send me toward a thing without a reason. That is the first thing I want you to hold on to. The bottle Dana set aside, it matters. The toasts began after dinner. The best man went first, then Grant's sister, then a college friend who told a story that ran too long, polite laughter, clinking glasses, the usual. And then Charles stood up. He had a full glass of the prestige wine in his hand, and he tapped it with a fork until the tent went quiet, and he began the way men like Charles always begin, by talking about himself. He talked about building things. He talked about standards. He said that a wedding was a merging of families, and that he believed in being honest about what each family brought to the table. I felt it coming the way you feel weather change before the sky does. He lifted the bottle, not the glass, holding it up so the label caught the light, the way a man reads a price he is proud to have paid. He read the estate name aloud, slowly, savoring it. He talked about terroir. He used the word pedigree. He said that some things in this world are simply of a higher class, and that you cannot fake it, and that breeding shows. And then he looked down the length of the tent, past the guests, past his own smiling wife, and he found my father. My father was sitting near the head table, quiet, one hand around a glass he had barely touched. He was not doing anything. He was just being there, being a farmer in a jacket at a rich family's wedding. And something about that seemed to offend Charles at a level I still do not fully understand. Now, I don't want to embarrass anyone, Charles said, which is what a man says right before he does exactly that. But I think it's important, on a night like this, to be clear about who we are. This, he lifted the bottle higher, this is what refinement looks like. This is what generations of doing things right produces. He gestured with the bottle toward my father. And then you've got the other end. No offense meant, Etienne, but let's be honest with the room. Your father is trash. A pause. The tent went very still. Just a farmer who smells like his own dirt. There's no shame in it. Somebody has to do it. But it isn't this. He set the bottle down and swirled his glass, satisfied like a man who had said something brave. And the room laughed. Not all of them, but enough. Enough that it filled the space under that white tent and hung there. A cousin near the front actually clapped. Preston, the one who had mocked my father's hands, laughed loud enough that I could pick his voice out of the rest. Vivian smiled into her wine. And Grant, my husband, my Grant, went pale and looked at me with something like horror. But he did not stand up, and he did not say anything, and I have had to make my own peace with that in the time since. I want to tell you what I did in that moment because it is not what you might expect. I did not stand, I did not shout, I did not throw my water in Charles Halloway's smug face, though God knows I wanted to. I have played that version 1,000 times in my head, and it always feels good for about 2 seconds, and then it feels small. Instead, I went very still, the way my father goes still. Not angry, not yet, just very quiet and very awake, the way you go when you have decided to pay complete attention to what happens next. Because I was watching my father. And my father had not flinched. He set his glass down on the table gently, the way he sets down anything he respects. He straightened his jacket, and he wore that smile. The same smile from the engagement dinner when Preston laughed at his hands. The same smile from the first dinner when Vivian waved off his life's work as playing in the dirt. It was not the smile of a beaten man. It was the smile of a man who has been holding a card for so long that he has grown comfortable with its weight. He looked at Charles, and then he looked at the bottle Charles had set down. And then, and this is the part I keep coming back to, he looked at the bottle Dana had set aside for me near the head table. Just a glance. But he found it. He knew exactly where it was. That was when I understood that my father had known this was coming. Maybe not the exact words, but the shape of it. He had known, the day that case arrived in his cool room, that this wine was going to find its way to this room. And he had let it. He had said nothing. He had simply waited the way he waits for fruit to ripen because a thing pulled too early gives you only the harshness and you miss what it becomes. I still did not know the whole of it. I want to be honest about that. Sitting there in my wedding dress with a room full of strangers laughing at the man who raised me alone, I did not yet know why my father was smiling. I only knew that the smile meant something, and that the something was large, and that it was about to arrive. There were pieces I could not fit together. Why had he brought me toward that specific label 3 weeks earlier, letting me see it in his cool room, letting me almost taste it? Why had he told me a friend sent it when a friend, I was now certain, had not? And why, when Charles read that estate name off the front of the bottle with such pride, had my father's smile deepened, just slightly, as if the man had walked directly into a room my father had built for him? I did not have the answers, but I was a sommelier, and a sommelier learns before anything else that the front of the bottle is marketing and the truth is always on the back. The truth is in the small print, the vineyard designation, the grower, the source of the fruit. Charles had read the front of that bottle to the whole tent, loudly, proudly. My father had read the back of it weeks ago, alone, in his cool room, and said nothing. The laughter was starting to die down now. That is the thing about cruelty performed for a crowd. It needs the crowd to keep laughing, and crowds get tired. People were reaching for their glasses again, murmuring, a little embarrassed maybe, the way people get when the joke has gone a beat too long and the target has not given them the satisfaction of a reaction. Charles was still standing, basking, waiting for applause that was already fading. And my father rose from his chair. Slowly, no hurry. He has never once in his life been in a hurry. He buttoned his one good jacket, and he stepped past the corner of the head table, and he reached for the bottle Dana had set aside for me. He did not reach for Charles's open bottle, but for the sealed one, the one I had asked her to keep. He picked it up in those ruined hands, those hands that had been laughed at twice now under this same tent, and he turned it so the label faced him, and he looked at it the way I have watched him look at 41 vintages of his own life's work. The tent was quiet again, a different kind of quiet. People had noticed the farmer stand up. People were watching now. Before I tell you what my father did next, if you are still with me, do me a small kindness and tap the like button and stay to the end, because the last part is the part I have wanted to tell someone for a very long time. There are more stories like this one on the channel, and I hope you will stay for them too. Now, my father, holding that bottle in his hands in front of 180 guests who had just laughed at him, looked up, not at Charles, at the room. He let his eyes move across all of them, the golf friends, the cousins, the smug young man named Preston, Vivian with her wine, Charles still standing there with his mouth beginning to close. He took his time. He has always taken his time. And I saw him draw a breath, the small, unhurried breath of a man about to say something he has waited a very long time to say. He was going to speak 4 words. I did not know it would be 4 words yet. I only knew that the man who had absorbed every insult these people threw at him, every joke about his hands, every dismissal of his dirt, every laugh at his expense, was finally, on my wedding night, going to open his mouth. And when he did, the whole shape of the room was going to change. He said 4 words. He did not say them loudly. He did not point at Charles, or raise the bottle over his head, or turn it into a performance the way Charles had. He held it in those ruined hands, the estate name facing him, and he read it the way he reads a leaf between his fingers, and then he looked up at the room, and he said it plainly. I grow that wine. For a moment, nobody moved. I want you to understand how quiet it was. A tent that had been full of laughter 30 seconds earlier, and now you could hear the caterers stop moving in the back, the small clink of a glass being set down somewhere, the wind against the canvas. 180 people, and not one of them knew what to do with 4 words spoken by a man they had decided was nothing. Charles laughed first. Of course he did. It was a short laugh, uncertain, the kind you give when you are trying to reassemble a room that has slipped out from under you. You grow it, he repeated, smiling around at his guests, inviting them back in on the joke. Of course you do. My father did not smile back. He turned the bottle around so the back label faced the room, and he held it steady, and he read from it, not fast. He read the way I read a list to a table, letting each thing land. He read the name of the estate, and then he read the line printed underneath it, the line Charles had never bothered to look at, because Charles read the front of things, the price, the prestige, the part that was made to be seen. My father read the small print, the grower designation, the source of the fruit. And the source of the fruit was a vineyard east of Sonoma, 12 acres, his. I need to be careful here, because I have told this story a few times now, and people always want it to be bigger than it was. They want my father to secretly own the chateau. They want him to be a hidden billionaire who was slumming it in a jacket. That is not what happened. That is not how wine works, and it is not who my father is. Here is what is true. That prestige label, the one Charles paid $400 a bottle for, the one he lifted over the room like proof of his own breeding, does not grow the majority of its own fruit for its top bottling. Almost none of them do. They source it. They buy grapes or they contract estate fruit from a small number of growers whose soil produces something they cannot produce themselves. And for their finest tier, for the wine in Charles's hand, they had been buying from my father for 11 years, his fruit, his rows, his 41 vintages of learning exactly what that ground wanted. The name on the front was theirs. The wine inside was in the way that actually matters to a sommelier. He was not richer than the Halloways. I want to be honest about that too, because it is the whole point. He did not outmoney them. He never could. His savings account had one good number in it, the number it took him decades to build, and he had spent a chunk of it on my flowers. He drove a truck with 200,000 miles on it. He wore his one good jacket because it was the only good jacket he owned. But the wine that Charles Halloway had just used to call my father trash in front of 180 guests at my wedding had come out of my father's dirt. The room understood it before Charles did. I watched it move across the tent like light moving across a hillside at dawn, one table at a time. There was a man near the front, one of the golf friends who had been in the wine trade himself, and I saw his face change first. He knew the label. He knew what a grower designation meant. He put his glass down very carefully and looked at my father with an expression I can only call reappraisal, the look of a man recalculating everything he had assumed in the last 5 minutes. Then the table next to him caught it. Then a murmur, low, the sound a crowd makes when it realizes it has laughed at the wrong person. Charles was still holding his smile, but it had nowhere to stand anymore. That's not, he started, and he reached for his own open bottle as if the front of it would rescue him. He turned it toward himself and read the back for the first time in his life. I watched his eyes find the line. I watched him read the name of a vineyard east of Sonoma. I watched a rich man realize, in front of everyone he had wanted to impress, that the object he had chosen as the symbol of his superiority had been made by the man he had chosen as the symbol of his contempt. He did not have anything to say. That is the thing about men like Charles. They have a great many words for a room that is laughing with them, and none at all for a room that has gone quiet. My father set the bottle down. Gently, the way he sets down anything he respects, and he respected that bottle because it held his own work. And then he did the thing that I will remember until I am an old woman, the thing that turned this from a comeuppance into something better than a comeuppance. He thanked them. He looked at Charles and at Vivian and at the golf friends, and he said it was a good harvest that year, a cool spring, a long hang time. The fruit took its time. He said it without a trace of triumph. He said it the way he would say it to anyone who had complimented his wine, because to him that is all that had happened. Someone had praised his work to a room. He was pleased. "I hope you'll have another glass," he said. "It drinks better with food." And then he sat back down, and he picked up his own glass, the one he had barely touched all night, and he tasted it. And I saw his face do the small private thing it does when a wine is showing what he hoped it would show. He tasted his own harvest, poured by the family that had called him trash, and he approved of it. That was his entire revenge. He liked his wine. I have thought a great deal about why that landed harder than any speech could have. If my father had stood up and shouted, if he had said, "You fools, I made this. You have been drinking my life's work while you spat on me," it would have been satisfying. And it would have made him one of them. It would have been contempt answered with contempt. Instead, he answered contempt with the plain fact of what he had built. And then he wished them a good glass of it. He gave them nothing to push against. There is no comeback to a man who thanks you for enjoying his work. The cruelty had needed a small man to aim at, and there was no small man there. There never had been. The loops close here, and I want to close them cleanly, because I have left you holding a few of them. The label. Why my father had that same case of prestige wine in his cool room 3 weeks before the wedding. It was not a gift from a friend, though he told me it was, and I understand now why he softened it that way. The estate sends him a case of the finished top bottling every year from the wine made with his fruit. It is a courtesy between the grower and the label, a way of showing him what his grapes became in their hands. He had 11 of those cases, one for every year, lined up in the cool room where I had walked past them my whole life without ever reading a back label. My father, the man who taught me that the truth is always in the small print, had a wall of small print in his own house, and he never once pointed at it. I have wondered, said about that too, why I asked her, on my wedding day in my dress, to keep one specific sealed bottle within reach of the head table. I told you I did not fully know why. I think I know now. I had seen that case in his cool room. Some part of me, the sommelier part, the part that reads a room the way I read a list, had already made the connection I was not ready to say out loud. I set that bottle aside because a piece of me already understood that it was going to matter, and that when the moment came, my father would want the sealed one, the whole one, the one that had not been poured out and warmed and turned into a weapon. He wanted to hold his work intact when he claimed it, and I had put it there for him without knowing I was doing it. And the smile I could not stop turning over, from the engagement dinner, from the first dinner when Vivian called his life's work dirt, from the moment Charles read the estate name aloud with such pride. I understand the smile now. It was not the smile of a man who did not know he was being insulted. It was the smile of a man who knew that the thing being used to insult him was in fact him. Every time one of them raised that label to prove they were better than my father, they were raising my father. He knew it every time. He could have said so at any dinner, at any slight, at the first warm glass. He chose not to. He waited, the way he waits for fruit, because a thing pulled too early gives you only the harshness, and you miss what it becomes. He was waiting for the moment it would mean the most, and they handed it to him on my wedding night with a toast. I asked him about it later, after the guests had gone, when it was just the two of us on the edge of that grass lawn that had never grown anything. I asked him why he had let it go on so long, why he had let them believe he was small when 4 words would have stopped it years ago. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, if I had told them at the first dinner, they would have been nice to me. They would have wanted my wine, my name, my connection. They would have treated me well because I was useful. He looked out at the dark. I didn't want to know them as people who were nice to a man who was useful. I wanted to know who they were when they thought I was nothing. Now I know. He shrugged, a small farmer's shrug. It's better to know. That is the part I want you to sit with, because it is the whole thing, and I do not want to hand it to you as a slogan. My father did not win because his wine turned out to be expensive. The wine was always his wine, the day before the wedding and the day after. Nothing about him changed in that tent. What changed was what the room could see. He had been exactly this man the entire time, at the seating chart, at the warm Cabernet, at the joke about his hands, at the missing +1. A man who built something real slowly, with his hands over 41 years, and who did not need anyone to know it in order for it to be true. Worth is not the number in an account or the price on a front label. It is what you build and who you are when you think no one who matters is watching. The Halloways had a great deal of money and no way to make anything grow. They mistook the price of a thing for the making of it, and their contempt, the contempt they aimed down the length of that tent, never touched my father at all. It only showed the rest of us exactly what kind of people were holding it. That is what contempt does in the end. It does not diminish the person it is aimed at. It exposes the person who carries it. Charles thought he was reading a class into that room. He was, his own. I did not feel triumphant that night. I want to be truthful about that, because you might expect me to. I did not feel the hot rush I had imagined 1,000 times, the version where I throw the water in his face. What I felt, sitting in my wedding dress on that lawn with my father, was something quieter and much larger. I felt proud, not proud that he had won, because he did not think of it as winning. Proud that he was mine. Proud that the man who raised me alone among the vines, who turned a bad seat into a good view, who took the mark of 41 harvests as a thing to be worn and not hidden, was exactly as large as I had always known him to be, and that for one night the whole room had to see it too. And underneath the pride there was a kind of clarity, clean and cool, like the first taste of a wine you have waited years to open. I knew who my father was. Now I knew who I had married into. And I knew which of those things I would spend the rest of my life protecting. Grant and I are still married. That was the other thing I had to make my peace with, and I will not pretend it was simple. He did not stand up for my father that night, and he has had to live with that, and so have I. But he was the only Halloway who came to the vineyard the next weekend, alone, without being asked, and stood in the rows at dusk and let my father put a pinch of soil in his hand and tell him whether the ground was thirsty or content. He is learning to read the small print. It is slow. Everything worth anything is slow. My father would tell you that. Charles has never apologized. I did not expect him to, and I have stopped needing him to, which is its own kind of freedom. He does still buy the wine. He does not mention where it comes from. So let me leave you with the question I have carried since that night, and I would like to hear your answer, wherever you are. If you had been my father, standing in that tent with the whole room laughing, holding 4 words that could turn everything around, Would you have said them years earlier and spared yourself the insults? Or would you have waited the way he waited to see who these people really were first? Tell me in the comments, tell me your city, and the time where you are while you are there. I read every single one. If this story meant something to you, hit like and subscribe, because there are more stories like this one on the channel, stories about quiet people who were underestimated by loud ones, and what happened when the room finally understood. There is one more thing I have never told anyone. A week after the wedding, a letter arrived at the vineyard. It was from the estate, the prestige label, the one on the front of the bottle. They had heard what happened at the reception, and they were not writing to apologize. They were writing to make my father an offer.